Good evening. I am honored to be here today to share with you this unique opportunity of listening to one of the great writers of the 20th and the 21st centuries. On behalf of us all, I would like to thank the Berlin family for making this event possible, and Mario Vargas Llosa for being here. My name is Vitória Saramago, and I am an assistant professor at the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures. As you will have noticed, I am not Agnes Lugortiz, who was originally scheduled to present the event today. We concluded that it makes more sense to have a scholar of Brazilian literature introducing a novel on Brazil, and a scholar of Caribbean literature introducing a novel on the Dominican Republic. So with that, let me take you to a scene in Brazil. On October the 2nd, 1897, Brazilian photographer Flávio de Barros took a picture of the prisoners, or rather survivors, of the Canudos War, the conflict between the Brazilian government and rural workers in the country's northeast. These survivors were mostly women and elderly people. The young men had died in battle. Sitting on the dry desert ground, surrounded by the Republican Army that for months had killed their kin and devastated their intentional community, their vacant gazes partially hidden by mantles, their children hanging in their arms, these women of various races and backgrounds seemed Trojan in their defeat. Helens, Cassandras, Hecubas, mistakenly placed in Canudos in the turn of the 20th century. Their anonymous faces portray two tales. It is an enduring image of both Brazil's most famous messianic movement and one of the most disturbing historical conflicts. In 1981 novel, The War of the End of the World, Mario Vargas Llosa gave names to these tragic faces, Maria Quadrado, Catarina, Jurema, and named the absent dead men as well, João Abade, João Grande, Leão de Natuba, among others. But every name has a story. To these names and many others, Vargas Llosa gives a vivid fictional existence, scarcely seen in narrations of the Canudos War. In The War of the End of the World, the author continued his development of a polyphonic style by expressing the diversity of views at stake in the Canudos conflict, disclosing the discrepant viewpoints of the war. On the one hand, we have the thousands of rural workers surviving the misery, exploitation, and harsh climate of Brazil's backland, who, animated by the messianic leader Antônio Conselheiro, or Antônio the Counselor, by sheer force of will, built a town in the inhospitable desert. On the other hand, we have the Republican troops sent from capital Rio de Janeiro to deny this group's political autonomy, troops who see in the intentional community of Canudos only a monarchic rebellion blended with religious fanaticism. Moreover, in between these two poles, we have intellectuals finding in Canudos the spark of a genuine popular revolution, old nobility strategically positioning itself to retain its influence in the area, and many, many other perspectives. The War of the End of the World has been understood as a shift in Vargas Llosa's work, putting him in dialogue with 19th century literary realism in the mode of Leo Tolstoy and others. The comparison between The War of the End of the World and Tolstoy's War and Peace was proposed by Uruguayan critic Ángel Rama in 1982, and he emphasized, and I quote, the intensity, amplitude, and coherence of the project, and its sovereign narrative wisdom, end of quote. While such a transnational comparison makes sense outside of Brazil, in Brazil, indeed in Latin America, another comparison beckons itself. I am thinking here of Rebellion in the Badlands, the 1902 account written by the Brazilian author and eyewitness of the war's last moments, Euclides da Cunha. It has been available in English since 1944 in Samuel Putnam's celebrated translation published here by the University of Chicago Press. An intriguing mix of sociological treatise and epic narration with positivist undertones and a near-Baroque style, as well as with a voice of protest against the brutality and blindness of the Republican Army in those first years of post-monarchic rule in Brazil, Rebellion in the Badlands started a tradition of representing the Canudos War in which Vargas Llosa participates. It is a long tradition of long works, from the lengthy Rebellion in the Badlands in the early 20th century to José Celso Martínez Correia's 25-hour-long carnivalesque, or rather anthropophagic, theatrical adaptation in the early 21st century. In Vargas Llosa's novel, as in many other works about Canudos, the same mode resonates. We can never document Canudos enough, yet no documentation suffices to give a sense of what Canudos was. When Mario Vargas Llosa decided to write the novel after an invitation from the filmmaker Rui Guerra, to write a screenplay for a never-concluded film on Canudos, the author rigorously researched the event and even traveled to the Badlands of Bahia to follow Antônio Conselheiro's path. This research is as visible in the War of the End of the World as its own limits. It is when the documents about Canudos become silent that the voices of the novel's numerous fictional characters brilliantly provide us with a sense of the pain, the faith, the blindness, the despair, and the courage that marked that war. I know that you all are eager to hear the author talk about this novel. Please join me in welcoming Mario Vargas Llosa.
Good evening. Many thanks to Victoria Saramago for her very kind presentation. Well, I'm going to talk this evening of my novel, The War of the End of the World. I wrote this novel because I read a book which was very, very important in my life, Oxertóes de Euclides da Cunha. Euclides da Cunha wrote an extraordinary book, which I think is indispensable to understand what Latin America is, and particularly what Latin America is not. His book is called Oxertóes, and it's about the War of Canudos. The War of Canudos is something that experienced Brazil a few years after its independence. In 1888, the monarchy in Brazil abolished slavery. And 1 year after the monarchy was abolished in Brazil, it was a peaceful event, unlike what has happened in Latin America, in other Latin American countries, that the independence came with wars and with trauma. In Brazil, independence was more or less a peaceful event. It happened in 1889, and it was through an alliance, an unusual alliance between intellectuals and military, that the independence occurred. The influence in this movement of the positivist philosophy was enormous. The emperor left the country, and there was practically no social, political trauma. The great majority of the, let's say, urban, civilized Brazil accepted the republic with enthusiasm, convinced us, the intellectuals and the military were, that the republic will be a very progressive transformation of Brazilian society, that with the republic things will change, particularly in favor of poor and marginal Brazilians, that the country will be transformed in the way of United States have been transformed and converted in a very modern and rich and powerful society. United States was one of the models that the intellectuals and Republican military in Brazil had in mind when they produced this transformation of a country from a monarchy in a republic. They were really convinced that a social motivation was the great engine that had produced this changement of monarchy in a republic. And that is the reason why they were very surprised when they knew that in the northeastern Brazil, in the interior of Bahia, in the backlands of the country, there was a popular movement against the republic, a movement of peasants, of poor people from the interior, from a region that was at that time, still now, but at that time, much more than now, completely isolated from the rest of Brazil. So the intellectuals and the military, but particularly the intellectuals, didn't understand what was happening in the northeast Brazil. Why were people against the republic? If the republic had been produced to ameliorate the conditions of poor people, to bring justice and a real progressive social policy in the country. So as they didn't understand what was happening, they did what intellectuals do when they don't understand what is going on around them. They invented a theory. And the theory that they invented was that actually it was not what was happening there, a popular movement against the republic. It was totally unthinkable that the poor people were against the republic when the republic was for poor people. So what they decided was happening there was that the enemies of the republic were, of course, the real rebels against the republic, and that they was using these poor peasants, half-bred, black Indian people from the backlands, and that these enemies of the republic were, of course, the monarchists, the civil servants, the functionaries of the monarchy, the landowners, particularly the landowners who had been very close with the monarchy, and England. England had a very close economic, political relationships with the monarchy. So he decided that what was happening was a movement against the republic produced by an alliance of Brazilian monarchists, England, and that the poor people was manipulated by these powerful people of the related intimately to the monarchy. One of the intellectuals who produced this theory was Euclides da Cunha. Euclides da Cunha was a fanatic Republican. He had been in the military academy, and he had been expelled during the monarchy because he didn't salute a minister of the monarchy. So he became an engineer. But he was also at the same time a journalist. And he wrote many articles against what was happening there in the backlands of Bahia, repeating these ideas, which were actually myths, that what was happening there was not a popular rebellion against the Republic, but a movement produced by the enemies, this hierarchy which was deeply aristocratic, unpopular, racist, very selfish. And he wrote in a Sao Paulo journal very dramatic articles denouncing this movement and exhorting, the Republic to repress in the very energetic way this rebellion. Who was leading this rebellion? A preacher, a very strange character called by his followers the counselor, el consejero. And he had been preaching Christianity, pure and, let's say, elementary Christianity in the backlands of Brazil. Not in the littoral of Bahia, but in the interior, in the world of caboclos. Caboclos, half-bred of Portuguese, Indians, blacks, very different kind of society from the Bahia's littoral, in which the African influence is enormous in the music, in the extroverted kind of people, and in the geography, which also very, very different from the geography of the backlands. And the counselor and his followers have been traveling around the backlands for many, many years. And what the counselor said about Christianity was that Christianity had been changing, decomposing itself, that it was important to return to the elementary times in which the whole life of an individual was completely consecrated to religion, to the spiritual world, which was the real and important world. And the isolation of this region was such that only 4 years after the establishment of the Republic, the new laws, the reform that the Republic has introduced in Brazil reached the backlands of Bahia. So they discovered only 4 years after that the Republic has established the civil marriage, as if the religious marriage was not enough for Christian, for believers. That the Republic had established that people had to pay taxes. Even the peasants, the poor people of the backlands had to pay taxes. That the Republic was established a census in which people were asked about religion, about race, and it's fascinating how all this was interpreted immediately by the counselor. And his interpretation, of course, was immediately accepted by his followers. We don't know much about the counselor. There are no personal and direct testimonies, because the people who followed him were illiterate people, so there are no written documents about the counselor. But what we know is that he was a very charismatic person, and that his ideas, his convictions, his prejudices immediately contaminated the followers, and that the followers were, in all those years, have been growing and growing. Well, when the reforms of the Republic reached the Chancellor, he interpreted immediately, saying, so they want to know what race is ours. Why? Because they want to know who the blacks are. Because they want to reestablish slavery. They want to destroy what the monarchy has given us, which is the abolition of the slavery. They want the slaves again. And the Republic has established the civil marriage. They are the enemies of the Christianity. They are the enemies of the true religion. So, and they want that we to pay taxes. So they want to rob us. The tax collectors will be the worst enemies of our people. So he said, what is happening in Brazil, in the world, is extremely serious. It's something that has been announced from a long time ago by the Capuchins, the only Christian order who was present in the Badlands of Bahia were the Capuchins. Los Capuchinos? Capuchins? Yeah? The Capuchins. And the Capuchins have been explaining to us since a long time ago that if one day the monarchy is abolished and is replaced by the Republic, the Freemasons, the Antichrist, would have taken power, and that the exterminations of the true believers will start immediately. So this is a kind of historical frontier. The dog, that is the devil, has taken the control of Brazil. The Republic is the Antichrist. So we have to fight. If we believe in Christianity, if we are true believers, we have to face this challenge. Behind the Republic is the devil, the Antichrist, the Freemasons, the slave owners. So he destroyed all the publications that were exposed in the villages, in the small cities, in the Badlands, Brazil. Well, at the beginning, what was happening there, the destruction of the Republic laws, of the Republic instructions, was known only in Bahia. It didn't reach Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, the big cities of central and south Brazil. The governor of Bahia sent a company, a military company, to punish these rebels, and this company was completely destroyed by the rebels. So that produced some scandal, but was not taken very seriously. So the governor of Bahia sent after this company a regiment with a colonel, Colonel de Brito, and the regiment went to Canudos, a little place which has been taken over by the counselor and his followers. It was part of a land which belonged to a nobleman who had been very close to the monarchy. He had been even a minister of the monarchy in a given moment. So Febronio da Brito went with the regiment to punish the rebels, and also the regiment was completely destroyed by the Canudos, the Canudos Jagunços, as they were called, the rebels, followers of the consigliere. the defeat of this regime was already a big scandal in Brazil. It reached Rio, Sao Paulo, the big cities, and immediately the theory that this rebellion was actually moved by the monarchies, the exiles, and England was taking more and more reality in the press, in the political discourses, and in the agitation that among the Republicans, the progressive ones of the time, produce. And so the government, the federal government, decided to punish the rebels, a regiment which was very famous in Brazil because the Colonel Moreira Caesar, who was the chief of this regiment, was a fanatic Republican. He was a fanatic Republican. He had repressed all the movements against the Republic, which were very scarce, very few, but he had been totally intolerant with any kind of manifestation against the Republic. And he was a Republican who also thought that the best way in which the Republic could produce all this positivist transformation of Brazil was if the army, the military, were at the head of the Republic. He wanted a dictatorial republic. So this regiment of Moreira Caesar was sent to Canudos. And this regiment, for the third time, was again destroyed completely by the rebels, and he was killed, Moreira Caesar himself. So that was a big, big scandal all over Brazil, and it's very, very interesting to see what the press of the time was saying about this. The defeat of Moreira Caesar regiment was considered the proof, the indisputable proof that it was England which was providing the rebels with weapons, with guns, and that it was a lot of money behind this rebellion. And so it was the Brazilian army, practically, the Brazilian army which moved towards Canudos. And the author of Ochertoes himself went to Canudos with the fourth expedition. And it's fantastic to see what he wrote from Canudos itself during the last battles of the war of Canudos. He was an authentic Republican. He wrote what he saw. And what he saw were all the myths of the theory invented by the Republicans to understand what was going on with the counselor and with all this rebellion. He wrote, for example, in an article called Nuestra Vendée, because of the rebellion of Brittany during the French Revolution, the rebellion against the revolution. And he said that among the rebels captured by the military were fairy gentlemen who obviously were not Brazilian but English. They were the British officers that were advising, the followers of the counselor, that the rebels were using a kind of weapons that only the British Navy had, and that this has been proved, demonstrated by the military technicians. It's fascinating to see what he wrote, because what we was describing was the myth, the fantasy invented to explain something that nobody in the civil, modern, urban, civilized Brazil could understand. Well, the fourth expedition destroyed entirely Canudos, and the repression was absolutely brutal, brutal. Nobody knows how many people died. It is said that they were 30,000, 35,000, 40,000, nobody knows. But what was very, very interesting is that after the massacre of the Jagunços, of the rebels, the only intellectual that was able to ask himself, what have we done? Where are the British officers? Where are the British weapons? These poor people are the poorest people of Brazil. They are the former slaves. They are the poor peasants who don't know what Brazil is. So he decided to try to understand, not through the myth, but through the real observation of facts. And he wrote this extraordinary book, which is Osher Toys. He worked 3 years in this book, at the same time that he was working as an engineer building a bridge. The bridge and the book took him exactly 3 years. And, well, this is the book that I read. I discovered what Canudos was, and I was completely transformed because what had happened in Canudos is something that I immediately discovered had been happening all over Latin America, with different exterior facts. But what has happened in Canudos was something that had been happening in Mexico, in Central America, in Peru, in different countries of South America. The misunderstanding, the extraordinary misunderstanding between, let's say, the modern, the civilized, let's say, civilized part of a country, and the poor people, the Indian or half-bred or poor peasants of the country, this kind of total reciprocal blindness and this incapacity to understand what the other was thinking and believing had produced massacres very similar all over Latin America. And I felt reading this book the necessity, the urgency. It's the only time that has happened in my life, but it was really a fascinating experience to write a novel about this. The book of Euclides da Cunha was not a novel, was an essay, a sociological, historical, geographical, political essay, but I wanted this to be transformed in a fiction. And although I said to myself, well, this is crazy, you are Peruvian, you write in Spanish. What happened there was happening in Portuguese, in a Portuguese of the Badlands, a very archaic kind of Portuguese. You don't know anything about this country. How are you going to write a novel about this? I say it is completely idiotic. You should renounce to this absurd fantasy. But I couldn't. I was thinking every day in Canudos, in Euclides da Cunha, in the counselor, and I had also the urgency to understand what exactly had happened, why a country had been divided in such brutal way that nobody could understand what the other thought, wanted, believed. So I decided to write the novel. I started to read everything I could, and I think I read everything that had been written about Canudos until the year I started to write the novel. I went to Brazil, I went to the libraries of Brazil trying to read the papers of the time. I wanted so much to read a newspaper called O Jacobino of Alcides Guanabara, a journalist that he was probably the most important instrument to intoxicate public opinion with the myth that the rebellion in the Badlands was a rebellion produced by the monarchies, by the exiles, and by England. And I couldn't. There was no more journals of the Guanabara, neither in Rio nor in Salvador. And I decided not to go to Canudos and to travel in the Badlands before I had a draft of the novel. And it was very, very difficult for me to have this draft. The big problem that I had, of course, was language. I write in Spanish. The people of the story spoke among them in Portuguese, as I say, a very special kind of Portuguese, the Portuguese of the Badlands of Brazil. So I had to invent a character of Spanish that would suggest that the people who were talking in the novel were talking not in Spanish, but in a Brazilian archaic kind of Portuguese. I had so enormous, so rich material that it was difficult for me to. I had one character since the beginning, and it was a character from whom I wanted to write a story. But until then, I had written only contemporary novels, and it was reading a history of anarchism in Spain that I discovered that during the 19th century, there was a group of anarchists in Barcelona, Spain, who were at the same time phrenologists. They were convinced that pulping, you can say pulping the bones of the head, you could discover the personality of a person, and they were convinced that that was the scientific fundamentals of atheism. That was the way in which what is called the soul could be explained. And so they become anarchist phrenologists, or phrenologist anarchists. And I was so fascinated with this that I wanted to write a story about anarchist phrenologists. But how could I put an anarchist phrenologist in a contemporary novel? But in the novel of Canudos, at the end of the 18th century, absolutely, it was a time to use, to invent a phrenologist anarchist, or an anarchist phrenologist. And so it's the character of Galileo Gal, which is a very important character in my novel. I went to the interior of Bahia only after being working 2 years in the novel. I had already a draft, a very big draft, very confused draft. But I felt more assured of myself and ready to explore what were the traces of Canudos in the world in which these events took place. So I went to, and I was several weeks traveling in the interior of Bahia. I had a fantastic friend who was a Bahiano, a sertanero, who accompanied me, Renato Ferraz. And we went to visit the 25 villages in which the legend said that the counselor was there preaching and also rehabilitating churches. That was he did in all his traveling. With his followers, they rehabilitate, they reconstruct the churches which were deeply deteriorated, and they also rebuild cemeteries. They were considered as the death was the most important life, that the transit to the death, to the other world, the real world, was through the cemeteries. The cemeteries should be beautiful places. So they worked very hard rehabilitating, and it was a church that was entirely built by himself, only one, in Bon Jesus. And I remember I was deeply, deeply moved when we arrived to Bon Jesus, and I saw the little church built by the counselor and his followers. It was still the inscription that he had put in the front of the church, Deus è grande. But what was really fantastic during this traveling was that Canudos was absolutely alive in the mind and the memories and the nostalgia of the people of the Badlands. In every villages, Renato Ferraz always managed to produce a discussion, and there were fantastic discussions of partisans of the counselor and partisans of the Republic. And it was as if this had happened yesterday, because this was the most important thing that happened in this very isolated and poor and with a very monotonous kind of life. Everybody had a father, grandfather, an ancestor who had been fighting in Canudos. And I remember particularly a village called Wawa, where the priest of the village was a great defender of the counselor. He said he was the real Christian there. It was not Merida Caesar. It was not the Republic. The counselor was a real Christian. He could be an ignorant and he could have invented things, but he was a man completely consecrated to the spiritual life, and he had a moral which was so convincing, so authentically followed by practice by himself and by his followers. And there were fantastic discussions among what was the real meaning of the rebellion. And I remember that after these weeks traveling in the Northeast, finally I understood. Because I had been asking myself, but why so many people followed this man? How do you explain that they were ready to sacrifice themselves as they did? knowing that it was totally crazy to face an army, a modern army, with the ridiculous weapons that they could have. What the counselor gave these people to make of them such a committed, heroic kind of people. And I think I understood what the counselor gave them was a kind of orgullo, proud. They were poor. They were very, very poor. Yes, but precisely because they were poor, they were the chosen ones. They had been chosen by God to be the martyrs, to represent Christianity in its fight, in its war with the Antichrist, with the devil, with the devil itself. They had been exploited, they had been forgotten by the rest of the country, but they had been compensated by God. And they felt so proud of themselves that this explains this strange conversion of all the criminals, the cangaceiros, because all the criminals of the Sertão went to fight for the counselor. And the former slaves, the peasants, and some priests, in spite of the fact the Archbishop of Bahia had condemned the counselor and considered that what he was saying and doing was an aberration that couldn't be accepted by the authentic Christian church. In spite of this, many priests from the Badlands went to fight for the counselor. And this is what Euclides da Cunha, in this extraordinary book of Ochertoes, discovered himself. And he remembered how confused he was during the last period of the war, when he saw the Yagunzos attacking the army, shouting, "Down with the dog, down with the devil." And that the soldiers were attacking the Yagunzos, shouting, "Down with England, down with England, down with the criminals." It was a total misunderstanding. They were fighting a ghost. Each band was fighting something that had been totally invented because this total lack of communication between it. Well, as I said to you, I try to be totally aware of what has been written about Canudos, the historical, the political testimonies, but not in order to tell truth story of Canudos, not at all. What I wanted was to write not an essay, not an historical book, but a novel. So I took many liberties with the story. I tried to invent things, but within the limits of the real event. I don't think there is in my novel, in spite of the fact that there are many, many things that I invented that were not historically documented, but I don't think I exceed the reality of what really happened. The way in which I worked was, for example, this. There was only one testimony, a written testimony of what happened in Canudos at the beginning of the war or before the war. And it was a Capuchin monk who was sent by his order or by the bishop of Bahia, that I don't remember. The monk was called the Montay Marciano. He was one of the few persons who went to Canudos without being a Yagunso, without being a follower of the counselor. And this monk wrote a memorial, which is very, very interesting because he didn't understand much in spite of being there. He was so confused with what was going on that he didn't like it. That was the only thing that was very clear for him. He didn't like what he saw. He saw promiscuity. And he listened the speeches of the counselor all the evenings, things that they seemed to him that were not totally orthodox, that they were not totally within the accepted limits of Christian theology. But what he said in a given moment, for example, and this was for me most important than all the rest of his memorial, that there was always near the counselor a kind of monster, a little thing that was human, a little thing with a big head who used force to move, And he said he was the only one who knew in Canudos how to write. And he was there, very near the counselor, always writing everything, every word that the counselor said. And this immediately gave me the idea of a character for the novel, a León de Natuba, very important character. There is the only mention of León de Natuba, this phrase. And I decided that this would have a very dramatic kind of life because he was a monster. The way in which he became, because he was the only one who knew how to write, so important for the counselor. Well, all the principal characters of the novel have, as the León de Natuba, this origin. They were mentioned once, and so I immediately built a character using one fact and invented many, many others about his personality. What I respected was the way in which they were called among the rebels. And this because the military parts of the war mentioned them in many, many cases, not using their real names, but only the titles that they have. El comandante de la calle, the commandant of the street, la madre de los hombres, María Cuadrado, mother of men, mother of mankind, and things like that. They were very pompous kind of titles. And this you understand, because what they thought of themselves was not that they were just a small community in Brazil fighting in Brazil for. No, they consider themselves fighters of the Christendom. They were fighting all over the world. And the war for them was Canudos, what the war so limited in which they have born and lived and died. So they use these expressions that were a manifestation of this deep conviction that they were fighting to save humankind of the devil, that they were fighting for light against obscurity, that they were fighting for the good against the evil. And they believe it so deeply, so much, that they accepted to die in this terrible, terrible way. I remember when we arrived finally during our traveling in the Badlands with Renato Ferraz to Canudos. And it was very moving. Canudos doesn't exist anymore. There is now an artificial lake there. And around the lake, you could find centuries. What a fantastic number of, how do you say it, caserinas, the shots of guns. Caserinas, how do you say it in English? How? Well, that. But thousands of these shot of guns, and it was very interesting because the people of this place repeated to us, the counselor was right, because he said one of his prophecies was that the Sertão tornaría mar. And look, the water is there. The Sertão is now a sea, you know. And very few times in my life I've been so moved when I arrived, as I was when I arrived to Canudos and discovered that the war was still there, that the artifacts of the war were surrounded the lake, and that many people who live there around the lake was still remembering the counselor with great respect. Well, I think I've been talking too much. I'm going to finish the novel telling you one story. As I told you, I tried to find this magazine who had intoxicated the public opinion in Brazil, probably much more than all the rest of the newspapers. O Jacobino, the Asidio Guanabara. The last year in which I worked for the Nobel, I was in Washington at the Wilson Center as a fellow. So I could consecrate all my time to working in the last version of the Nobel. And to my big surprise, I encountered in the Library of Congress the complete collection of O Jacobino. It was there, complete, and I could consult it in my office at the Wilson Center. So I discovered that Brazilian historians, Brazilian investigators must come to Washington to discover the important documents about his history. Thank you very much for your attention.